all are advertisements placed by Thomas Nelson Jr., our namesake, right? This one is transcribed here at the bottom, and it's 1777, so we're in the midst of the American Revolution. Runaway last week, a young Negro man named Billy or Will. He's of the middle stature, of a yellow complexion, with small eyes and bad teeth. Whoever apprehends him and bring him home shall receive $5 reward. Thomas Nelson, right? So we have lots of these. So here are advertisements where he is kind of exercising his power as a master, even in the midst of the American Revolution, and he is trying to recapture his property as he would see it. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important, and it wasn't really addressed in most of the secondary literature or any analysis of Thomas Nelson Jr., is his inventory and will. And these are things I've worked with a lot. The inventory and will, they are down at the York County Circuit Court. Anybody can go down there and take a look at them. They'll even make a copy for you if you pay for it. But the inventory and will are two kind of very specific things. So the inventory is upon a person's death in the 18th century. If you're a man of kind of some stature, if you have stuff, they will go through your house and they will basically catalog every single thing of any worth in your house, right? And it's kind of interesting because sometimes you can almost see in your mind how a house was laid out, because they go room to room to room and they write down everything, and they write down the condition sometimes, and then they'll write down kind of an estimate, right? They'll tell you how much, they'll appraise it, and they'll put how much that's worth. So that's the first part, is the inventory. Then a few weeks later, they will probate the will. And so he already has a will that's written where he wants all the material goods that are listed in the inventory, how he wants them kind of split up, right? So that's kind of what's going on here. So I was lucky enough to find the will and the inventory, and I actually transcribed them, and you'll see an example of that here in just a second. But his inventory is interesting because, remember, this is everything that he owns at the time of his death. And it really does demonstrate that about 75% of Thomas Nelson's personal wealth is in the form of human beings. It's investment in human capital. At the time he dies, he has about 219 women, children, men, elderly, and infants that he lists as, or that are listed as property. He entails these human beings, and what that means is he perpetuates the continuation of slavery through this will. They don't go free. All of his enslaved people are either sold to pay debts or they are given to family members. And we'll see the havoc that kind of wreaks in just a second. He also is fairly rich. He owns thousands of acres in Warwick, Hanover, James City County, York County, and all of that is kind of split up and given to his family as well. All of his children are going to inherit enslaved people. Thomas receives Aggie, who at the time is living in York County, and it's together with her increase, except for her eldest son, Charles. And that's kind of a very hidden way, together with her increase. That means her children. So he is giving Aggie and her children, except for Charles. We don't exactly know what happens to Charles, but they'll all be given to Thomas. Philip is going to receive an enslaved girl, Melinda, then residing with Mrs. Brown at Bull Run. His son William receives his father's servant James Rideout. Except for William, all sons are given a Negro boy to work with the carpenters to learn the trade. And I'll explain that a little bit in a second too. So what this really kind of means too is, remember, all these enslaved people are living somewhere else. And through this will, they are going to be plucked from wherever they are living and kind of redistributed as Thomas Nelson sees fit. So they might have different owners, they could have been sold, they could have been, all kinds of tumult happens as a result of Thomas Nelson dying, right? The dominoes start to fall. Thomas Nelson's daughters are all given money and unnamed slaves. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth Page, is given a slave, Nancy, who is then in the possession of his mother. The nephew receives an enslaved boy named Dick. So all of this, again, happens at the behest of Thomas Nelson without any kind of real consideration for the people it impacts the most. When he dies, his executors are going to sell excess lands and properties, including enslaved people, to pay for Nelson's remaining debts. Now, if you go down to York County Circuit Court, this is what you'll actually find. This is what a real inventory actually looks like. And you can see it's written out in longhand and script, and it kind of hurts your eyes, and you have to focus very carefully on what it says. Here's what I just wanted to point out about this, besides how challenging it is to read one of these things. Look near the bottom here, and at this kind of second line to the bottom, it says 70 head of hogs, 23 pounds, 10 shillings, right? So just to give you an approximate price here of how much is a human being worth, 70 head of hogs is about 23 pounds, right? If you look a little higher on the list, you can see kind of what these people are valued. You can see Will, ditto, 120 pounds. Adam, ditto, 110 pounds. Major, a carpenter, 110 pounds. George, ditto, 120 pounds. Look at the value of these human beings. So a carpenter, a black carpenter, enslaved carpenter, is worth about 5 to 6 times 70 head of hogs. So kind of put that in perspective. He has, with 219 people, he really has invested most of his money in human capital at the time of his death. That's where he is. I actually did want to take the time, just out of respect for the people that are named in this inventory, I wanted to list all 219 of them. There was a small sample on the previous page, but I transcribed it. Every single person on that inventory is listed here. And you can come back and you can evaluate this. If you've never seen this before, it almost takes a minute to kind of soak it all in. So feel free to come back to the presentation and take a look at this. But there is kind of a system of how much these human beings are worth. So children are not worth very much. When they get to an age, especially boys, about the age of 12, 13, 14, you'll see kind of a spike in their worth, and that's because that's when they're expected to kind of become agricultural laborers and take on a little bit more of the work. Women are typically worth less than men. I will tell you that, an exception might be a female cook. She typically would be valued a little higher. If you look in the bottom left corner, right, you're going to see Major, a carpenter, 110 pounds. George, ditto, 110 pounds, right? The carpenters, by far, are one of the two highest valuated slaves. I would say blacksmiths and carpenters are absolutely the highest. So if you remember, I just told you in the last slide, or 2 slides ago, I told you that, remember, Thomas Nelson gives his sons a young boy to train with carpenters, right? And you might have thought, oh, well, that's nice. He wants them to have a career, or he wants them to have a valuable occupation. Well, he's not as concerned about the enslaved boys and what they're going to do with their life. That's essentially an investment. If you give your sons a slave that will train as a carpenter, look at the difference in value between a carpenter and just a general agricultural laborer, right? It's a big difference. They command a price that's far greater. So anyway, so just kind of keep that in mind. I will point out too, sometimes, when you're looking at these, you can see sometimes women are sold with their children, sometimes they are not. The elderly are kind of a special case here, and we'll talk about this again in just a second, but oftentimes the very old or infirm are valued at 0 here on the inventory. So, okay, so let's talk about Thomas Nelson. He does have a complicated history with race, right? Now, here's what I was just talking about. So in the inventory created at the time of his death, several enslaved people have a value of $0, or 0 pounds, I should say, actually. There's a notation that says old and infirm, no value. Now, this suggests that Thomas Nelson takes care of enslaved laborers in old age rather than selling them. And you might think, well, see, look, he's not so bad. What a benevolent guy. At least, he takes care of these slaves from cradle to grave, right? Well, that's actually pretty typical of 18th century slavery. Now, if you have in your mind 19th century slavery, where you're thinking of overseers and cotton and and selling slaves south, that would be in line with slaves that become old or infirm and they kind of outlive their productivity. When the slave south expands because of the adaptation of the cotton gin, and we're seeing that westward expansion into places like Texas and Mississippi and Arkansas, that's when, if you're old or infirm, you're often sold south, right? But that's 19th century. In the 18th century, it doesn't really, it doesn't mean that he's a benevolent master necessarily, because he hangs on to those slaves that are old or infirm, right? No one else would have wanted them. So it's not necessarily benevolence. The second issue here is that in Thomas Nelson Jr.'s will, there's a special mention that's given to an enslaved person by the name of Smith Harry. He is freed and discharged from all services. Nelson instructs Harry to be given a house, a good suit of clothes, 2 shirts, 2 blankets, 300 weight of pork, and 5 barrels of corn each year during his life. That's a pretty big thing for an enslaved person who he was enslaved. Now he gets his freedom, and Nelson is going to provide for him for essentially the rest of his life. It's interesting to note, of the thousands of slaves that Nelson supervises or owns over his entire life. Remember, he becomes a master, from the time he's born, there are slaves in his household. And so he's a master from the time of birth. But thousands of slaves that he has supervised and owned and sold and traded. This is the only slave that he gives their freedom. And it's kind of particularly interesting to note that this guy, I didn't miswrite his name. I said Smith Harry, right? It's not Harry Smith. He is Smith Harry. Why? Because he's Thomas Nelson's blacksmith. And I will tell you that Thomas Nelson is an absolutely committed horseman and horse breeder. He actually gives the horse to George Washington. He gives the horse to George Washington, that George Washington rides into Yorktown for the surrender with Cornwallis. And George Washington actually names that horse Nelson in homage to Thomas Nelson. So this is the only person, his blacksmith, who he would have had apparently a particular affection for or wants to reward. His blacksmith is the only one that he gives freedom upon his death. Within the scope of the Revolution, to George Washington from Brigadier General Thomas Nelson Jr., 1777. So he is obviously in charge of the Virginia militia here. And he writes to George Washington, and he says, "You may be assured that I will push with my utmost exertions to have the regiments completed, but to be candid, I am really at a loss to know in what manner that can be done," right? And here's where he's talking about enslaved people. He said, "Many of those that have signed up for service, free or mulatto Negroes, as it was generally thought they could be best spared, I think exceedingly unjust, because these poor wenches, after they have risked their lives and have contributed to save America, will not be entitled to the privileges of freedom." So he seems to kind of take umbrage with the fact that worthy African Americans that he sees as worthy or of having earned their freedom, not by nature of just being born and being a human being, but because they have worked for the patriot cause, will not be entitled to the privileges of freedmen. So again, complicated, all worth evaluating and kind of thinking over. Now, I want to take just a second. Let's consider the context of Virginia's Gentry Society, because part of this is not just Thomas Nelson's slave owning, right, or slave trading or slave selling. That's part of what we need to consider here. But one of the larger questions is, does Thomas Nelson really represent who we are as a college? So let's talk about the Gentry Society and kind of see if his piece of the puzzle really fits with us. He is born in 1938 into this rigidly separated social system. He's a member of the gentry class, which essentially means he's wealthy, he's landed, so inherits land, but he's not noble, right? He's not an earl or a duke, or he doesn't have a noble title. Virginia's population in 1770 is about 450,000 people. 4 to 5% of them would be considered of the gentry class, which roughly works out to about 18,000 to give or take 23,000 men, right? So 18 to 23,000 men are making decisions for the other 420,000. The other 95% would be made up of propertyless white men, women, Native Americans, African Americans, whether they be enslaved or free. Gentrymen are a very small minority, and they dominate economic, social, and political life. They will serve everywhere. They'll be in the House of Burgesses, they'll run Anglican vestries, colonial government, they'll serve as judges, right? They dominate the economy and the social world, social environment of Virginia. They are going to construct these elaborate homes, particularly in the Tidewater. And they don't build them just because they're pretty. They build them for purpose. They symbolize power and wealth. They need to show off and demonstrate their power, right? If you're kind of subjugating the other 95% of people below you, you need to kind of have something to back you up. And these houses and properties and plantations, they really kind of do that. The gentry are known for conspicuous consumption. Most have some kind of formal education overseas or at William and Mary. We know Thomas Nelson falls into that category. And we are going to see them over and over again. They will, work on dancing and horse racing and gambling. This gentry class society provides Thomas Nelson Jr. a role in government, education, wealth, and status. Remember, he just graduates from college, and his father has already gotten him a seat on the House of Burgesses. When he's on the ship returning home, I don't know about you guys, but when you graduate, I hope you're as lucky. Nelson's tremendous head start in life, coupled with the relatively small cohort of gentrymen that can actually participate as leaders in public life, allow him these very remarkable opportunities. Remember, it's a very small pool that he's competing with for these opportunities. And in some ways, to be honest with you, with that kind of head start in life and the very small pool, remember it's only 18 to 20,000 men, or 23,000 men that are actually participating in government, those odds of signing the Declaration of Independence just got a lot better, right? So just keep that in mind. All right, one of the big questions here is, so what? Who cares? I've been at Thomas Nelson for a year, and I don't even know who he is. What difference does it really make? Well, one of the things I wanted to really look at is how do we use Thomas Nelson here at the college, right? We are a public community college. We serve this very unique, very diverse service area. How do we kind of bring him in to your education here? Well, all of these, I will tell you, all of these are from an early period of time, from the 70s and early 80s, all of these pictures, right? So this might seem like a long, long time ago. And in the upper left, we had commercials where Thomas Nelson's riding a horse on campus. And in the center picture here is from a brochure of Thomas Nelson announcing classes. Here's an old graduation photo in the bottom left. In the bottom right, you might not be able to see it, but this is actually, this would have been the anniversary of Thomas Nelson's 250th birthday and the 20th birthday of the college. And it's actually at the Nelson House in Yorktown, and it's a big fancy soiree, a big fancy affair. So these are some of the ways that we've kind of incorporated him into kind of the fabric and the identity of the college. Okay, so those are a few ways that we've incorporated Thomas Nelson into kind of our institution and the personality of our institution, the identity of our institution. So let's just very quickly go back over this college naming timeline and find out how did we get here, right? So remember, the name Peninsula Community College was used for mailing purposes as late as 1967. By May of 67, Thomas Nelson Jr. chapter, Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution, present that scholarship for full tuition for one student annually. It is then very, very quickly after that that Thomas Nelson Community College is picked as the name of our institution. By August of 1974, it is moved, seconded, and unanimously carried that the buildings of TNCC shall be named after contemporaries of Thomas Nelson Jr., and a list of 4 names should be brought to that meeting, and that's in the college board minutes. Mr. Butler, and these dates are really important. This next series of dates are pretty consequential here. Mr. Butler distributed a list of contemporaries of Thomas Nelson prepared by Tiny Hutton, assistant to the Representative Downing. That's in the college board minutes from September 26, 1974. And of course, who this refers to is U.S. Representative Downing, 1st Congressional District of Virginia. He serves from 1959 to 1977. And Tiny Hutton refers to E.M. Tiny Hutton, who at the time is his administrative assistant, right? Also on September 26, 1974, later in that same day, the same session, the same meeting, the names of the buildings Harrison, Moore, Diggs, Griffin, Wythe, and Jameson are approved, right? Now, my point there is that they've requested names. They decided it was going to be contemporaries of Thomas Nelson. Clearly, someone did a little bit of research on contemporaries. They bring these names, this list of names, before the college board, and within the same meeting, with very little vetting or research, the names are approved, right? So just give a little bit of thought to kind of the process there. Now, what I want to do is take just a second and talk about the College Board. What really is their intent behind using the signer of the Declaration and his contemporary? So why Thomas Nelson, and why his kind of that cohort around him? Well, obviously, they were looking for one of the most famous native sons within the service area, and Thomas Nelson fits that bill. They also write about how the colonial theme fits the institution's mission and vision. It promotes the theme of opportunity and excellence. They talked about linking to history the region, and they think that it's going to attempt to send a message of quality and give us credibility. And here's kind of what's going on there, is that they really are talking about some of the older, really high quality institutions that are here on the peninsula. And specifically, they were talking about the College William and Mary and Hampton University. And the idea here is, look, they're old, we're brand new. The ink is still kind of wet on Thomas Nelson. And so to keep up with them, they think if they kind of link us to history of the region, history of the area, it gives us a little more prestige. And finally, they'll talk about wanting a name that made us seem more like a four-year school to aid in the ease of transfer. Obviously, one of the things we do here is we want students to transfer to four-year schools, and they thought Thomas Nelson Community College was kind of approximate of what you might find at a four-year school. So all of those are kind of reasons for using Thomas Nelson and for using his contemporaries. So one of the things that I would always tell my students is, anytime you're naming an institution or a building or creating a document, it is undoubtedly influenced by the environment around it, right? The time and the place and the space around it. So I'm going to give you a really, really silly example, and I know we're talking about something very serious, but it's a kind of an obvious example, and I think you're going to get the point that I'm trying to make here. So when I grew up, the name of the fast food restaurant was Kentucky Fried Chicken, and it had the striped buckets, and the Colonel came out and did commercials, and it was Kentucky Fried Chicken. Well, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that name will be rebranded and changed to KFC, as many of you know it today, right? Well, you might wonder why. Why, did they just want to save, the letters and the sign? I don't think that's really what it is. In the late 1980s and 1990s, remember, all of a sudden Americans are trying to be a little bit healthier, right? I can remember my dad sitting at the breakfast table eating Cracklin oat bran for breakfast. We're worried about trans fats and cholesterol, and Jane Fonda has a workout, an aerobics tape. It kind of is this very different era. And so if you can pull the word fried out of Kentucky Fried Chicken and make it KFC, you can kind of skip over that unhealthy element, right? It's just a rebranding. And so I know that's kind of a silly example, but it really does bring home the point that names of things are created in kind of a time and place and space. And so 1968, when Thomas Nelson Community College opens, this is essentially what is going on around the late 1960s. Every single one of the images that I put on the screen here are from 1968. It is a particularly tumultuous year in American history. And one of the things that has fundamentally shifted here is the civil rights movement, right? So the civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s, you remember we've got fire hoses and dogs, and people in the North are seeing this, and they're kind of, it's horrific what they're seeing and how African Americans are being treated in the American South, right? By the late 1960s, attitudes have changed a little bit. There's some faltering support. Many Americans are going to see more aggressive tactics by civil rights activists. They're going to see race riots. They are going to say that this is a disruption of cultural norms. It's an abandonment of patriotism when we see anti-war protesters, and a disregard for law and order. And so the selection of a Revolutionary War hero, especially on the peninsula, especially in an area where part of the land that Thomas Nelson Community College actually sits on was donated by Langley Air Force Base, right? We've got a strong military tradition here, fairly conservative, and it's a return to kind of a simple, uncontentious time. The American Revolution seems very agreeable, right? And so there also is the wrinkle that the study of history changes over time, and social and cultural history really, which would have been the factors that really contribute to serious analysis of African American history, doesn't really take root until after the Civil Rights Movement, right? So we are kind of now, in 1968, Thomas Nelson Community College kind of makes sense for where we are. I know there are a couple veterans of World War II that are on the college board at the time, and it seems simple and obvious. And I read you at the beginning of the presentation that there were, he looks good on paper and he has all these accomplishments. And to be honest with you, we're not even taking account another perspective. So we're not really thinking about, should we include women? Should we include African Americans? Should we include Native Americans? That's not even really kind of in our mindset at the time. So, it's not about blaming people or they should have done it this way. I just think now that we have a fuller picture of kind of who we are on the peninsula, who we represent, and who's really at our school. So 2 slides ago, I showed you pictures from the 70s and 80s, and I know that seems like a long time ago, and what difference does it make that Thomas Nelson is in the name? That's so long ago, right? Well, these are pictures that are all taken within about the last 5 or 6 years, right? So Thomas Nelson is still here, he's still around, and we really do have to confront the question of, does he represent who we are and who we want to become? This is a signing in the upper left here. We've got Dr. Dever, our former president, signing an articulation agreement with Old Dominion University. And who's in the background for us? Well, that's Thomas Nelson in the Declaration of Independence, right? Every time you sit in the Mary T. Christian Auditorium, on that podium on the bottom left, you can see there's Thomas Nelson looking out at us, right? We've had events where we have, people dressed up as Thomas Nelson. We have reenactors. We've had them at all college day for faculty. Up in the upper right-hand picture here, this is the 50th anniversary. This was just last year. And so we've got the 50th anniversary of the college. On every student's diploma, when they get that diploma in the mail, Thomas Nelson, the silhouette of Thomas Nelson Jr. appears on that silhouette. So it's worth considering. Do we want to kind of stand by the man and kind of his legacy? And that's one of the questions I'll kind of leave up to the people that are watching this video. All right, one of the things we can't argue with is he is still here, right? He's in the name. He pops up in all kinds of places. He's still here. Does he represent who we are? And I really do mean all of us, students, faculty, staff, community, alumni, all of us, right? We're all in this together. And I'll tell you just a really short story about this portrait. When I first became a faculty member here in, 2012, I moved into an office in the Historic Triangle, and this portrait was hanging right outside my office. I didn't ask for it. That's what they assigned me, and this was there. And all the students that came to visit me in office hours would walk by this portrait, and they would make a point to tell me how completely creeped out they were by this portrait. He is actually supposed to be, he's in college at the time this thing is painted. I think he looks like he's about 12 years old, but anyway, and they would always tell me the story of how it looks like a haunted house picture, where the eyes follow you. But anyway, but he is still here. That's the point I'm really trying to make. And I think we do have to evaluate thoughtfully, does he make sense for our service area still, right? He might have made sense in 1968. Right now in 2020, does he still make sense for our service area? Is he consistent with the mission of the college? Does Thomas Nelson and these other contemporaries, do they reflect the core values of our college? What does our college look like? What does our community look like? And are we really kind of thoughtfully representing all of our achievements of the region, industry, right? Are we taking into account other people that perhaps we could involve in the college? So just some questions to think about as we kind of go forward with this important conversation. Now, core values of the college, right? So one of the big questions here is, does he represent the core values of the college? I'll let you determine that, but here's what we have all kind of agreed upon, right? Students first, educational excellence, community responsiveness. Are we being responsive to the community by keeping Thomas Nelson and these building namesakes? Diversity, integrity. Are we honoring integrity and diversity? Mutual respect and shared governance. How do we kind of work through these issues and either keep these namesakes or change them out for something else, right? So look at the core values of the college and see where there is inconsistency or consistency. And just to keep it kind of all in one place and very centralized for you, I've actually pulled these numbers from the Thomas Nelson website. Our IRE department has been nice enough to pull these together. But when you're talking about, does he represent who we are, part of it, I think, is, we are a particularly diverse college. And so let's look at ethnicity. Let's look at gender. Let's look at kind of residents. Where the people that come and take classes here, where are they from, right? I will point out that neither Charles City nor Surrey are on the list here. So I think that one is kind of low-hanging fruit. If you're not in our service area, I hope that's not too controversial to say, you're probably out. So I'm sorry, Harrison. And I wanted to take just a second. What other options do we have, right? I will tell you, I have thought about this every minute since I joined this task force. Geographical names, and I see the move amongst other community colleges in the VCCS, and they're going to go the safe route, and they're going to pick a geographical name, right? And we've got colleges that have already done this: Northern Virginia Community College, Tidewater Community College, Rappahannock Community College, Virginia Western. Then the list goes on and on. Most of them are going to have these geographical names. We can also kind of base building names on donations and fundraising and sponsorship. And that's not a bad idea. We've done that in the past, right? We did that with Espada. We did that with Hastings Hall. That's not a terrible idea either. But I started this presentation and I said, everybody take a deep breath. Institutional change is inevitable, right? It doesn't have to be such a bad thing. I actually consider this a tremendous opportunity. I really do. I think this is, I've said this before to people, but this is probably the most important contribution as a history professor here I'll make in my entire career. I mean, I take it that seriously. And I see this as an unbelievable opportunity. I think it helps us define who we are, what's our role in the community. I think it clarifies the values that are important to us. If we want to be deliberately diverse and kind of show that off, here's our chance. I think it really does give us a chance to remedy past naming choices. So, they worked in 1968. If we decide that they don't work now, we really do have kind of a pathway to kind of reconciliation and reconsidering. I think it's a really unique chance to engage our community, right? One of the things that is kind of obvious about the last building names and the college name is almost all of them are from Yorktown, right? And York County. That's one part of our service area, but how does that really represent Hampton or Poquoson or Williamsburg or Newport News, right? Let's think a little more broadly. What suggestions? Let's put it out to the localities and the localities we serve, the service area. What suggestions do they have? Who would they like to honor, right? That's a real opportunity. I will tell you, of course, as a historian, I think choosing the name of an enslaved person and really kind of turning this scenario upside down, we really did for the first 50 years have a view from the top down, right? Gentry Society down, the very privileged, and then the 95% of us, the rest of us, right? And so we took a top-down approach. I really think we could offer reconciliation. I think it's a chance to set things right. It signals to the community that we get it, right? If we go from the bottom up, pick an enslaved person right? How does that represent our students? A lot of the students I teach, and I'm in the classroom every day, I would consider them kind of underdogs, right? They don't have a lot of money. Maybe they didn't do particularly well academically in high school. They have challenges. They're working full time. They have kids. You know, they're a little bit of an underdog. And does Thomas Nelson, this gentryman who has every advantage, does he really represent who they are? I don't know. I think an enslaved person, especially someone who succeeded and beat the odds and managed to contribute in a very real way, I think that would be absolutely inspirational. So I leave it to the community to decide. I leave it to the board to make their recommendation to the VCCS. But I think that is a real, I think that's a real consideration. It should be a real consideration, right? And we should be mindful of that. I also will say, look, we've been in a period of decreasing enrollment, and it's not the reason to do it, but it doesn't hurt that we would become one of the first U.S. colleges named for an enslaved person, and the press that could kind of drum up might be really, really productive. And what you might be saying is, Stace, why would we pick another person? Could this happen again in 50 years? We pick a person and it turns out they're, you know, kind of a disaster, and then we have to rename the college all over again. I will tell you that this is very unlikely to happen if we chose an enslaved person. Why? Because the records on enslaved people are so scant and so few that it is very unlikely that something like this could crop up again. So I think it warrants serious, thoughtful consideration. And just because I'm very prepared, I've got a couple names for you to consider. Now, I didn't put this together all by myself. I had some help in the archives, and they helped me put these together. I will tell you that the first four are the ones that are some of my favorites, just from a kind of a historical perspective of the area. But there are lots of choices here, right? That's what's kind of cool about where we live. So I like Mary Smith Peak. She is in Hampton, teacher, humanitarian, a free black resident of Hampton. Best known for starting a school for the children of former slaves, starting in the fall of 1861 under what became known as the Emancipation Oak near Fort Monroe. And what really spoke to me, I guess, as a community college faculty member is that she is so committed. She teaches nearly 50 children in the day and 20 adult learners at night after work. And that is what we do. If that doesn't speak to kind of the mission and who we are. So Mary Smith Peak, I think, is a good candidate. James Armistead, right? James Armistead is an enslaved man. He works as a spy. He's kind of a double agent. He provides critical intel, which actually helps Americans win the Battle of Yorktown. So the British are unsuspecting of him because he's an enslaved guy, right? So he kind of comes and goes, and he's able to listen. He's in the room when things are being discussed. He passes all that information on to the Patriots, and we actually probably win the Battle of Yorktown because of some of the information that he's able to pass. He petitions for his own freedom after the American Revolution, and he's actually refused several times. The Marquis de Lafayette actually steps in and petitions on his behalf, and then ultimately he is going to be freed. So I think he is just kind of remarkable and amazing and brave, and what great characteristics for our college or our buildings. The Marquis de Lafayette, so I just mentioned him in the last one. He is, you know, this Frenchman. He joins the American Revolutionary cause when he doesn't have to. He just sees it as kind of his moral obligation. He's French, and he helps secure the victory at Yorktown. He returns to France. He campaigns for a constitutional monarchy and against slavery. He becomes only the 5th honorary U.S. citizen in history and comes back to Yorktown to visit many years later. I mean, if he doesn't, you know, kind of speak to the global impact. I mean, he's an early humanitarian and has a vision for helping outside of France. And he's looking at kind of freedom and the emancipation of human beings kind of globally, right? And then, of course, he steps in and helps James Armistead. Lydia Broadnax. I mentioned her before and told the story about her and George Wythe, right? What really speaks to me about Lydia Broadnax is I think that the system of slavery that we created in Virginia, right, while obviously it is most detrimental to the African Americans who served, I think it really speaks to the idea that a system like that, that inhumane system, isn't just bad for African Americans, it actually corrodes and kind of poisons who all of us are, right? So even the white folks on the other side, when it comes down to justice, it's kind of corroded because Lydia Broadnax is not able to testify against the great nephew who poisons George Wythe, right? So the whole system is kind of broken down, and I think that kind of there's something kind of thoughtful and kind of poetic about that it corrodes all of us and kind of corrupts our humanity. So anyway, other people have donated the names at the bottom, and I'll let you kind of look over those. Maybe there's some opportunity for a sponsorship there, but lots of big names from this area. I will tell you that if you choose any of these names, deceased is probably best, right? You don't want something terrible to happen while they're like in their older years and we have to rename something. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. I hope that I've helped in some real way. I'm sure you can probably think of names as well. Every locality here should be represented. I think we should have men, we should have women of all races. Let's make it look like us, I guess, is the suggestion I would make. And let's let this be the opening of the conversation and some hard conversations to be had, but I think they're kind of well worth it. Please feel free to contact me at the college if you have any questions, if I can be of any help in this process. So thank you, and thanks for taking the time to listen.